to our second series we're calling FAQ, Frequently Asked Questions. And this is a question coming up that I'm especially interested in. I still have questions on myself, so it's always fun because I'm always learning. It's always growing. This way of interaction between the Bible and the subject matter we're going to get into today. But first, I want to read with our scripture reading this morning before we dive in. And it just says this. This is the psalmist speaking in Psalm 19. And you can just kind of listen. It may be on the screen, it may not, but just kind of listen to these words. He says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, God has pitched his tent for the sun. It's like a bridegroom coming out of a chamber, like a champion rejoicing to run its course." Beautiful words from the psalmist. And as we looked at last week, talking about what the Bible is, we recognize that the Bible has all kinds of different genres of literature from different authors, different time periods, and this would be in a poetic form. But yet, did you know that poetry can also portray truth? And so right away, as we read this, we're faced with a question in today in our kind of modern world, and that's this: do the heavens really declare the glory of God? Is there something about creation and the created order that can point us back to God? Or has what has been commonly referred to as just science, kind of a general term, shown us that God may be unnecessary for the world that we're in today? That's the point of tension that we're facing this morning. And this is the question: are the Bible and science compatible? That's our question for this morning. We're only going to get to scratch the surface on it. It's a big topic. That's another reason why we're doing the podcast, which maybe some of you got a chance to listen to from last week, where John and I got together and had it's not a short discussion anytime you get John and I together, Tanner over at Cove. But hopefully it was a helpful discussion, and we're going to be doing that again this week, covering this topic. So if you have questions, I may raise more this morning than I answer for you. If that's the case, that's okay. So we're going to continue on with that and hopefully give some more resources as well. But this question is debate both outside and inside the church. And because of that, we're dealing with what I would call a peripheral or secondary issue. Now, what do I mean by that? This is what I mean, is that there are people outside of the church who tend to use science as kind of a stick to beat up God or Christianity or other religions with. That just happens in our world, okay? We know that to be true. I'll give you an example here in a little bit. But at the same time, there's also a lot of discord, a lot of conversations around how the Bible, certain interpretations of the Bible and certain interpretations of science really mesh together within Christianity itself. So in that sense, there's an internal debate, right? So these are people who could have said the Apostles' Creed, just like we did in Christianity itself. So in that sense, there's an internal debate, right? So these are people who could have said the Apostles' Creed, just like we did earlier this morning, and affirm everything in that, and yet land in different places in how the Bible and science relate to each other, okay? And so an analogy that I'll give you is this. Think of a spider web. In your mind's eye, you can even close your eyes for a minute if you need to, and just think of a spider web. By the way, anybody just been walking through the woods? Now's the time when spiders are out, and then you just like catch that web like right in your hair. That's just like the worst, right? I hate that. Anyway, so a spider web is connected to parts of the external world. So it has its own little web there, right? And it has connections that it's hanging up on. And then in the center of this web, the central kind of core of it is very important. Because if you notice, you can take and you can poke holes in certain parts of a spider's web, but the web remains intact. This is how the spider feeds, right? He goes out, catches his fly. You see little holes throughout the periphery of the web. But if you were to go and you were to poke a hole right through the middle of the web, what happens? It all comes down. Its integrity is disrupted. So when we're talking about this question of how the Bible and science are relatable, how they are compatible, what I mean to say is that this is a peripheral issue. In other words, Christians can disagree about this and still be, and we should welcome them and as brothers and sisters and work together on them. I don't believe it's a central core issue that should take the whole enterprise of your faith in Jesus and the revelation that he has come and given his life, died, and rose again for us as our follower, and then we can come and follow him and be in his kingdom. That shouldn't necessarily be affected by how we view or what our theology is between science and the Bible. So with that said, though, I do want to give us some guiding principles and ideas, and I will talk about something at the end of the message here that I believe is a core issue. That is something that we all should agree upon as followers of Jesus. So that's one thing I want to mention right from the outset, is this can be an internal debate, and we are open here at South City from different perspectives. We don't hold a typically hard line on these things. Number two, I really appreciate science. I love science. I actually work for a company. You know how I feel about the Bible. We talked about all that last week, obviously, but also this idea of what science is, I have a particular fondness for it. I work for a company that is a major pharmaceutical company in the world, and one of its core values is simply this: we follow. And I've got to say, I'm very grateful for that. That's something that I think is a wonderful idea to do, especially when you're dealing with the subject matter that we are in medicine and in the development of certain drugs and compounds that can help heal and move people towards wholeness. That's a very good thing to do, to follow the science in this particular area. Speaking of subject matter, I want to go back to what we talked about last week. If you remember, when we tackled what is the Bible, I said this. I said, if you want to know what something is, you need to know two things. What is it made of, and what's it made for? We talked about the Bible last week. It's what its makeup is and what its purpose is. So this week what we're going to do is follow that same course and talk about science and try to answer, what is science made up of, and what is science for? And right away, I want to say this. When we think about what the Bible, or what the makeup of science is this: methodologies and persons. Methodologies and persons make up what we typically think of as science today. Why is this important? Let me illustrate. This is a personal story that happened to me just a few years ago. I was at a dinner party with some friends, and we had been friends for quite a while, and they knew my background, I knew theirs, and we knew that we didn't quite see eye to eye on God and Christianity and other issues, but that didn't stop us from being friends. And so we were out at dinner one night, and a conversation got started, and these kind of conversations are always interesting to me when someone brings up a question to you that seems like it's one of those compliments, but it's with a backhand. You ever heard of that? The backhanded compliment, right? And so this person says to me, you know, you always seem like a pretty thoughtful person. So far, so good. Then here comes the but, right? But it always kind of interests me in how you can still believe in the Bible and trust the Bible. And I said, well, that's a very, what makes you say that? And she looked at me and just deadpan face said, well, you know, science. And I thought, okay, that's a science, yes. What is it about science? And so then now the conversation is going, right? But just that simple comment, well, you know, science, as if that in itself is like a conversation stopper and all that needs to be said on this long, long history of how science and the Bible relate. And so what I want to talk about first is, what is science anyways, right? The word science itself comes from the Latin scientia, which simply means knowledge. It means knowledge. And in fact, the term scientist actually came into its popular usage in the mid-19th century. Not until the mid-19th century. Earlier, there were people who were called or thought of as philosophers of nature, those sorts of things, dating all the way back to Plato or Aristotle. I mean, some early Greek thought that talked about physics or the way that the world moves and its motions, and then other writings along this time were called natural philosophers. But there came a point in the mid-19th century or so where something called the scientific revolution came about. And what I want to say right off the bat is this very interesting to me, place in the Western world that had a history of Christianity and belief in a type of God that did create the world in a certain order. And several historians of science and not, whether they were Christians or non-Christians, have noticed that it's in this particular place in the human context of both chronologically in history and also place and geographically, where what we think of now as science actually arose and grew. If you look at books like from Rodney Stark, a certain historian, he'll talk about this rise, and he'll say that there are certain fundamental necessary factors that make this more plausible and why it happened here. And one of those, he says, is that these people believe that the universe was not just some random or cyclical thing that's been here forever, but it's, or maybe that just happened by accident, but that they believe that God designed it. And because it was designed, they trusted that if they'd studied it, they might actually be able to learn something from it. There was order, there was consistency. And that idea was something that sparked the inquisitiveness and the rise of science. The thing that did uniquely here, because other cultures believe that, but in a Christian context, we believe that God not only created this world and just set it spinning, well, we believe that he came and actually made himself part of it. In the incarnation of Jesus Christ, that the Word became flesh. Had all kinds of understanding of order. We just talked about that. But they didn't have any impetus to actually study it, because in their worldview, the dirt and the earth was the center of the universe, but that wasn't a good thing. That was actually a bad thing, because everything settled to the center and down. And so the lowly and the dirty things were here, and the starry heavens above were where all the good and great things were, which are kind of hard to study and touch. That's why astronomy was the first and earliest science, because that's what people cared about. But all of a sudden, when Jesus comes and when Christians start coming up and influencing culture, what you see now is a return to the inherent goodness of creation. Because in the Hebrew mindset, everything is spiritual. There's not this idea of, well, there's like earthly stuff and spiritual stuff, but it's this idea that life itself and that we were formed from mud and clay, but yet we have God's breath breathed into us. And so understand the natural order of things, even the dirty stuff that makes up our biological and physical sciences. And it was out of this womb of the understanding of a created order and the goodness of this creator that's been breathed into it by God that science really gets going. And that's why if you look back in history, the great scientists that we know, most of them are Christians. And they talk about this very openly and how they're trying to study and learn God's mind after him, the world that he's given us. So it's just kind of interesting that there's certain aspects about what we believe that actually contribute to the birth of what we now know of as science. The question is, have we moved past it? The origin of where it came from, to then say we don't need those foundations anymore. And so what we want to say is right now is that people mostly have a rough and ready definition of science. It's about understanding natural phenomenon through definition of science. It's about understanding natural phenomenon through observation, experiment, method. Or I should say methods, because this is another important distinction. Because here's how this conversation went. I asked her, I said, what do you mean by science? And so basically the scientific method, rough and ready description I just gave you. And I said, okay, that's still pretty general. Maybe it would help me understand if you could give me the exact science you're referring to, because really there are actually just sciences. There's biology, and there's chemistry, and there's geology, there's physics. There's a lot of different sciences. And you know that the same way that they methodologically study a cell is not the same way that they go and use particle physics and try to understand the very beginnings of the universe through theoretical physics and others, that there are different actual ways of the universe through theoretical physics and others, that there are different actual ways to experiment and to move different fields or methodologies of science. And so I was trying to get her to help me understand where it was and what actual science textbook that maybe was peer-reviewed, where there was something that actually disproved the nature of God or who Jesus was or something else from the Bible. And when you put it like that, you find that it doesn't exist. It's just not there. It doesn't exist. It's just not there. Because the two subject matters are different. Let me pause here and say this. What I told her was this. I said, the reality is that science doesn't say anything about Christianity or about the Bible, because science isn't the kind of thing that says anything at all. Scientists say a lot of things, okay? And that's why it's important to think about the methodologies, which are wonderful and help us in so many ways, and the people, which are also, many of them, wonderful and help us in so many ways, but just to realize that sometimes these people can take the methodologies of science and extend them beyond their proper use. What do I mean by that? Here's an example. Documentary called Cosmos. It was originally hosted by a guy named Carl Sagan in the 70s. Recently was redone again by another scientist, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Wonderful people in their own right. But the opening to that documentary says this: all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. Now, look at that statement for a second. Let's put our thinking caps on for a minute. I know we're in church, but hang with me. The cosmos is all there is, there was, and ever will be. Now, by cosmos, he just simply means the physical universe, the entire universe, right? Now, we want to ask a question here. Is this a statement of science, or is it a statement outside of physical nature about science? Think about the version here, of science or about science. So you might ask, what scientific theory from what scientific discipline has their journal that has come up with the conclusion and demonstrated, without a shadow of a doubt, that the physical world is all there is, was, or ever will be? There isn't one. Because that's a statement about what science has done or can do, not of science itself. That's a statement about what science has done or can do, not of science itself. I had these two boards that I was trying to get disconnected from each other this last weekend. We were traveling. I needed to disconnect these two boards. And so I immediately went and got a hammer and a chisel. And I started trying to wedge these two boards apart. And I'm going to tell you something, it was not working. Okay, it was getting very frustrated. I even I broke down, asked my wife to help me, and even through all, and she's very strong, and even through all of our efforts, we cannot get these two boards undone. And then it hit me. I looked and I realized these boards aren't nailed together; they were screwed together. Right? So I realized, wait a second. I need to go get my drill and put a certain kind of drill bit in there, and then voila, zzz, out come the screws, open comes the board. Why does this matter? It's because for the right job makes all the difference. And you see, what Aristotle knew long ago was that it's the subject matter that should dictate the method which you study it, not the other way around. You don't cram a methodology of studying something and impose it on something else that can't even be looked at or understood by that methodology. You can't squid a square peg in a round hole. You can't undo boards with a chisel and a hammer. You need something else, a different kind of tool. And this is essentially what I think some folks tried to do, science beyond its reach of studying and observing and being able to come up with recognizable and repeatable theories about the natural world, which is what it's really good at when they extend it beyond that ideal. Here's a quote from a Nobel laureate, Sir Peter Medawar. He said this in his advice: "There's no quicker way for a scientist to bring discredit upon himself and upon his profession than roundly to declare that science knows, or will soon know, the answers to all the questions worth asking. The existence of a limit to science is, however, made clear by its inability to answer childlike questions such as, what are we here for? What is the point of living? We could add some other questions as well. How did Bach make such beautiful music? Why is it better to help my neighbor than to betray him? Why do my kids make me laugh? How do I know my wife really loves me? These are important questions, but they're not going to be found, the answers won't be found in a science book. More recently, Ian Hutchinson, a professor of nuclear science engineering at MIT, he's written a book called Monopolizing Knowledge, and this is a very fascinating book if you want to pick it up. Because what he deals with in here is he deals with scientism. The subtitle for Monopolizing Knowledge is this: A Scientist Refutes Religion-Denying, Reason-Destroying Scientism. Now, what is scientism? Scientism is basically the belief that science is the best, and in its stronger form, the only way to gain real knowledge. Now, let me show you how this works. We'll leave that up there on the screen for a second. Think about this statement: science is the best or only way to gain real knowledge. Now, what science is that from? Did they find that in biology? Is that a conclusion from physics? Is that somewhere in like geological soil samples somewhere or some test tube? No, it's not forthcoming. You won't find that in any kind of science book because it's a statement about science. Itself is not a statement of science. And because of that, it falls on its own sword. It's like saying the best way to know something, the only way to know something is by science. Well, how'd you know that? It wasn't by science. So do you really know it? Well, no. Oh, okay. You just literally contradicted yourself. Right? And so it's so easy to turn a certain kind of scalpel and dissect another belief system with a tool, but never think to turn it back on yourself to see if yours can hold up to the same type of scrutiny. And this is what happens a lot because part of our culture has been inculcated, has been just assumed in an atmosphere, opinions, and many of them are very, very good opinions, and many of them are very, very good opinions of scientists and the scientific community, whereas what the reality is that many of these opinions are always changing. Because the science of 100 years ago is not the science of 50 years ago. It's not the science of 20 years ago. There's been a book recently by a guy named Joshua Swamidass, who's a genealogical computational scientist, brilliant guy, who's just released something within the last 2 years that is completely shaking the foundations of genetics and genealogical research to show that there very well was and could be interpreted as the data, a connecting and close point in our historical past where we have literally come from two ancestors, possibly in historical Adam and Eve. And this is being well read and widely regarded, not just in like Christian faith communities that want to believe this, but it's shaking the entire. Just go look it up, Google it. It's not, just don't take my word for it. And so you see that even in these areas, these ideas of how science is to be interpreted and how what we're to do and relate to it change. So, how can we both understand this idea of what counts for knowledge if we don't just limit ourselves to the scientific method in our five senses? Because really it is knowledge that helps us to have access to our world. It gives us the authority to act and to help and to train others into action. And so we might say this: can we have knowledge of God? What does the Bible say about us having knowledge of God? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, you're probably thinking it's about time. This is a church. So let's go to Romans. Let's go to Romans. Book of Romans here. Let's save my spots. I'll need that later. We'll go to Romans chapter 1. And we're going to go to verse 18 and 20. This is Paul talking to the church at Rome. He says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." Verse 19, "Since what may be known about God is plain to them." Why? Because God has made it plain to them. Verse 20, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." That is a powerful statement. Think about that. How often do we talk about Christianity as a faith tradition, which it surely is, but tradition? It's a tradition of deep insight into the inner workings of people and their relationship with God and how to put them in touch with something that goes beyond the five senses, where all real life is eventually lived. And it's saying that there are things that we can know, that this world that we can use, our five senses to feel, touch, taste, smell, see, calculate, work on, that there's something about the contingent nature of this world that serves as a pointer to something, almost like one of those child's puzzles, you know, the ones where you start these different dots, and you start connecting the dots, and all of a sudden you connect one dot, then two, then three, then four, and all of a sudden a picture emerges. You think, wow, that's really cool. Like that just, it's a combination of this kind of line of reasoning. And I think that's what Paul's referring to here, is that there seems to be something from the outside world that impresses upon us just by its sheer contingency that didn't have to be here, and by the order that we observe in it, that there's something about these two things that press into us that point us to something beyond ourselves. And we're left asking, well, who made it? Why did we come from? Why is it here? And he's saying that there's parts of this world as a creation of God that shows his eternal power, his great mind and the ordering of the cosmos, and his power in speaking it and bringing it about. There's certain aspects and attributes of God that we can know just by looking at what he's made. And if you know any artists out there, you know that that's true. Their art is a reflection of who they are. And their art matters to them. Even not artists. Their creation matters to them. Have you ever eaten something that your wife cooked and not like it? Yes, that is the right answer, or never. It's never happened. Why? Because you know she made it. It's obviously awesome. Right? And so here's the thing. And we know that when people make something, they care about it. It's like, you just threw my dinner out. You don't love me? You don't care about me? Why'd you throw my dinner out? Well, it wasn't very good. Well, I made it, though, so it must be. So you understand? So there's something about this idea of creation, and we were born to create. You just look at a little child. The first thing they want to do is create something, and they want to say, it's mine. I did that. That's me. Where does it come from? So interesting, and Paul wasn't the only one to recognize this. Of course, he had been reading the Psalms. He knew the Psalm 19 that we just talked about, and how ancient writers thought that the heavens did declare the glory of God. The skies proclaiming the work of its hands day after day. They pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. But it wasn't just the Hebraic mind. Also in the Greek mind, they had examples of this. Listen to this from a famous Stoic philosopher around Paul's time, Epictetus. Fun to say that 4 times. He was a contemporary of Paul. He says this: is not the order in things and order obvious to thought sufficient to prevail on men and make them ashamed of leaving an artificer out of their scheme? Artificer, that's just a fancy word for like designer. So have them explain to us how it is possible that things so wonderful and which carry such marks of contrivance should come to pass spontaneously and without design. Even today in contemporary science, this urge, this impulse toward design and order shows up. Francis Crick, who was a Nobel Prize-winning scientist for his part in the structure of DNA. We have Hudson Alpha right here in Huntsville. We're a big science NASA town and Hudson Alpha genomics town, right? And Francis Crick was one of the ones who originally discovered the double helix nature of DNA. But he would say this constantly. This is a direct quote. He would warn biologists that they must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather just evolved. And when he says evolved there, he doesn't just mean a theory of evolution that could be benign or even could be mapped onto a Christian worldview, which I actually think it can. We'll talk about more of that in a second. You may want to hammer on me for the podcast on that statement. But what he's talking about, evolved in a way without God, clearly. I don't know what Paul would say, suppress his knowledge. That these things that he's looking at and studying are really the effects of a designer and have a design behind them somehow. And so what I want to say is that this simple statement carries these assumptions that we should just explore and think about. Dallas Willard says this. He says, given the physical world, however much of evolution it may or may not contain, there is or was some order in it which did not evolve. We come here upon a logically insurpassable limit to what evolution, however it may be understood, can accomplish. And this eventually is what my friend told me. She said, well, I guess really it's biology when we're dealing down to which science it is. And she said, in evolution, it just seems like it's made God obsolete. Like you don't need God since we have evolution now. And I said, what if I told you that I thought evolution actually presupposes creation? What would you think? She said, I want to hear more about that. I said, well, good. So let me try it on for you. The idea of evolution is a theory about the survival of the fittest, not their arrival. Right? It's not a theory of origins. And so for evolution to get place, you have to have a progenitor. You have to have a certain thing with entities and characteristics and potentials in an environment that then selects for those potentials, randomly or not, and moves them forward in a certain process. But that environment, the potentiality that's in that order that's there, and everything else there that could be possible for evolution to even get off the ground and going, screams creation to me. There's no reason why it doesn't. And it's not that you have to be an apologist for evolution to see that. It's just as John Lennox points out, he's a professor mathematician at Oxford, he says this, evolution purports to be a biological mechanism. However, it is a category mistake to confuse an impersonal mechanism with personal agency and imply that one rules out the other. It's like saying that since we have a mechanism for how we get an iPhone, we no longer need Steve Jobs. Oh, I went up to Detroit and I found factories that had Ford written on them, and I understand how Fords are made. So Henry Ford, no need for him. We'll just erase him out of the history books. It doesn't make sense because a mechanism and agency are two completely different things. Here's an analogy. If you were to come in and see a pot of water on my stove boiling, and you were to ask me, why is there water on the stove boiling? I could give you a pretty interesting description of the physical mechanics of what's making that happen, that there's certain molecules in the water, hydrogen, oxygen, they're speeding up and being agitated because there's being heat applied to it from underneath the surface, and as those agitation rises and the speed of the molecule rises, it gets hotter and hotter that we measure via via a thermometer, and I could explain that, and then once it reaches a certain point, guess what? Boom, boiling water. You'd be like, well, that's fascinating, Or I could say the water is boiling because I'm about to make some mac and cheese. It's going to be delicious. Because I put it in the smoker, and it comes out of the smoke, and it's awesome. My smoked mac and cheese is to die for. But you see what I'm saying, though, right? It's that you can have a mechanical explanation of something, or you can have a personal explanation that has purposes and intentionality behind it. One doesn't exclude the other. It can inform the other in certain important ways, but they can be in conversation, and then they can also have their own fields and limitations for which they want to impose in our understanding. And really, they just make our understanding bigger, not smaller, when we take the larger view. Now, with that said, what I want to say is this. The key doctrine that all Christians should fall in line with, the center point of the spider web, is this theology of creation. Not the how or the details behind the physical aspects of creation for exactly how God did it. There can be some disagreement there, and there's an interesting conversation to be had, and I totally welcome it. But the fact of the purposes and the why and the who, what kind of God is this exactly? And has God done anything since? Has he interacted with this world anywhere since? That has huge implications on who we are today. Let me check my time. I'm getting close. And before you say, oh, are you just acquiescing to like this contemporary science? And is this just, if you're not taking a hard stand on this and you're not going to go in and give us all the interpretations of Genesis 1 through 2, are you kind of wimping out on that? What I would say is this. I'll just give you a quote here from Augustine, who's writing in the 4th century, early church father Augustine. He says this, usually, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, the other elements of this world, about the motion and orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions about the predictable eclipses of the sun and moon, the cycles of the years and the seasons, about the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds as being certain from reason and experience. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh it to scorn. I just figured it would be only fair to anyone who may be listening out here or watching who thinks I'm just picking on science and scientists by giving the quote from Peter Medawar or Ian Hutchinson's about the overreach of science. I want to at least include this quote to say that we as Christians can overreach our own case, especially when we take questions to the Bible, to the Scriptures. We forget that it wasn't written to us originally, it was written for us. Another way of saying that, as I mentioned in my podcast last week, another way of saying that is that we always come to the words of the Bible remembering that it came to someone else first. And so understanding and thinking about the original audience and the original questions and what it was that these people would have heard in these accounts, especially in the accounts of, say, Genesis and others, is we recognize that we let the Bible speak for itself. And when we come in and oppose our own certain questions on it that it wasn't designed to ever answer in the first place, sometimes we can look pretty silly. And we need to recognize and value the contributions on both sides of this debate with humility and have an openness to them, while still holding fast that we, as followers of Jesus, believe in a God, the Father, creator of heaven and earth. And that makes so much difference. What difference does it make? Well, think about this. It means that that ultimately this universe is not a matter of time and chance, that we aren't, as persons, what the Nazis used to call blood and soil, just a mixture of that, but that we have purposefulness, that we are designed, that we are here for a reason, and that we are the creation and part of the creation of a God who is interested in it, because just like we are interested and care about our creations, God cares about us. And we know furthermore that he loves us so much that he would actually get involved into his own creation and come in the form of himself in Jesus to let the Creator Word do what it could to him. You know, Jesus performed miracles. He worked within the world to, and that's a whole other topic, we can talk about that later, but he also submitted himself and was submissive to natural forces of the world as well. He became hungry. He became thirsty. He understood what it was to suffer, to die. And when he performed miracles or signs and wonders, he always did it for someone else, for their good, for their, and to reveal his own message and his own power. And so what we see is we have in Christianity a way to see the heavens declaring the glory of God from the outside and also from the inside. Immanuel Kant said this: there are two things that are too wonderful for me, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. The other piece of creation that we know God from is ourselves. We look into ourselves and we see the brokenness in our own hearts. We feel the alienation that we have in our relationships with other people. We find that sometimes there's a brokenness in us, not only between people that we don't know, but between people that we should care about and love. The closest ones to us, sometimes we hurt the most. And also within our even selves, we feel disjointed. That's why people say all the time, I'm just beside myself. And ultimately, a lot of people, they feel like there is something out there. They just don't know what, and they just feel like there's a ceiling between them and God. And the good news, where the gospel comes into this discussion, is that we believe in a God who's a good creator, sustainer, and also redeemer of the one and the broken parts of this creation, who has come to put things right, that we can worship, that we can see and sing about, that we can point others to, that they would come to this, they would realize that there is a limit to what you can know by science. You'll never know the purpose, the intrinsic value of persons, the goodness or love, because you can't find those in a test tube. But all that can be found in a personal relationship with Jesus. If you're here today and you have questions, you still have unanswered, you still feel tension in this world, you're listening, I want to encourage you. That's a tension you may have for a while. There's all kinds of ways of reconciling that tension. But the tension you have with yourself and your failure to live up to your own expectations and what the Bible calls sin, there is an answer for that, and his name is Jesus. The best thing you can do is trust in him to tell you who you are, whose you are, to begin redeeming your life and putting this word into practice, and then to see how, as you grow in knowledge and wonder, that the heavens truly do declare the glory of God, and that you yourself are one of his masterpieces. Amen. Let's pray. God, thank you for this word to us today. I just pray, Lord, that we would get a glimpse of how wide and high and deep is not just your power in creation, God, but is your love for us. That, God, we wouldn't let the immensity of this universe detract us from the understanding that you humbled yourself, became the very form of a servant, being found in human likeness. God, we thank you, Lord, that you have gifted people with the ability to design and to do good science and to learn more and more about our place in this world, in this universe, and to help people to grow, God, that this is a historical movement that, Lord, is a grace given to us by you, God. We're so thankful for your gifts of intelligence and inquiry and all of the good things that come from that. God, ultimately, we're thankful for the gift of your Son. Let everything that has breath, God, praise you, and may we praise you now and give you back your glory and your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.